Welcome to Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, where we believe Benjamin Franklin's advice that an investment in knowledge pays the best interest, both in finances and in your life. Every episode teaches you personal finance and long-term investing in simple terms. Now, here's your host, Jesse Kramer.
Hello, and welcome to episode 102 of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. My name is Jesse Kramer. If the U.S. government was a household, would it be drowning in debt or simply managing a big mortgage? Or does that analogy between the government and a household not make any sense at all? And perhaps we need to rethink and correct the way we conceptualize government debt. Today, we're going to dive deep on the U.S. national debt. Ultimately, we're going to discuss how the national debt actually impacts your daily life, your investments, and your financial future. But to get there, we're first going to explain how we got here, why we keep going deeper into debt on what seems like an annual basis, why some experts simply aren't that concerned about the national debt whatsoever, why the U.S. national debt is fundamentally different than household debt. I guess I didn't really bury the lead there too much, did I? And what the path forward out of debt looks like. Long story short, my goal here today is that each of you leave this podcast episode feeling like you understand the U.S. national debt situation significantly better than you might understand it right now. And if need be, perhaps you'll make some changes on the personal side of your ledger based on what you learn here today. So let's break down Uncle Sam's debt situation, connect the dots to personal finance and long-term investing. But first, a quick review of the week. This one comes from Ashby, who left us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and said, "Excellent pod. Jesse does an incredible job of breaking down complex financial topics into easy to understand language. I'm a big believer that successfully navigating financial planning and investing is a relatively simple process. It's Wall Street that wants us all to believe it's so complicated. Jesse does a nice job cutting through the noise." Well, thank you very much, Ashby, and thanks to all of you who leave your kind words or 5-star reviews on your podcast players. Ashby, when you hear this, drop me an email to jesse@bestinterest.blog, and I'll send you a super soft Best Interest t-shirt. Okay, back to the national debt. The U.S. has carried debt since its very inception. Debts incurred during the American Revolution, that's the 1770s for you playing at home, during the Revolutionary War, amounted to $75 million in debt, primarily borrowed from some domestic investors, mainly from the French government, to help the rebels, as it were, buy some war materials. And then fast forward to today, our debt stands at $36 trillion as I record this in February of 2025. And by the time you're hearing these words, who knows where it'll be? 36 trillion and change, we'll say, just a little bit of change on top of 36 trillion. And that U.S. debt, it's broken down into two main components. The first is what's called intra-governmental, or within the government itself. A good example of that is currently that the U.S. government owes debts to Social Security and Medicare. There were many years during the 20th century mainly where, as an example, Social Security took in more tax dollars than it paid out in benefits. Right? There was a surplus, an annual surplus of Social Security money during those years. And somewhere on the government's books in its accounting, Social Security lent those surpluses to other governmental wings. And now the government owes a debt back to Social Security. We can kind of easily use right here that common metaphor of the left pocket owing money to the right pocket. The government owes money to itself. It's not quite the same as a real debt. It's a debt on paper, but it's all under the umbrella of the U.S. government. And in that way, we shouldn't really count it. But once we go beyond intergovernmental debt, though, now we get to the debt held by the public, or debt that the government owes to anything and anyone who's not the government. It's outside of the government's umbrella. Of the 36 trillion in debt, about 7 trillion of it is intra-governmental, which means that the other 29 trillion is owed to entities outside of the government. Of that 29 trillion that's owed outside the government, and we are going to spend a good amount of time explaining exactly what's going on there, roughly 25% of that debt is owned by foreign countries, and the remainder is owned domestically here in the USA. But okay, exactly. What does that mean? How does another country own our debt? Or actually, for that matter, how do we own our own debt? What does that really look like in practice? And the simple answer here, and it is a simple answer, is Treasury bonds or Treasury bills or Treasury notes. We've talked about here before on the podcast how bonds are simply the act of owning someone else's debt. Corporations all the time or governmental bodies, your local county, the state, they issue bonds to raise money, right? They need to raise money somehow, and they borrow money by issuing bond. Someone else buys the bond and says, I will buy the bond for $1,000. It's a loan. You owe me the $1,000 back plus interest over time. That's what a bond is. And treasury bonds are the form of the U.S. government's debt. If you own a treasury bond, which almost all of us probably do somewhere in our portfolio, then the U.S. government is indebted to you. And right now, there are about $29 trillion in U.S. treasury bonds in existence. Again, 20 to 25% of those are owned by foreign countries and foreign investors, and the remainder are owned by domestic investors and domestic institutions. As investors, we all know that bonds pay us interest. So yes, that means that the U.S. government is paying interest on the debt that it owes us. In fact, in 2025, that total interest payment is likely to approach $1 trillion. Now, on an annual basis, does the debt grow or shrink, and why? Well, in recent decades, it's done nothing but grow. And the simple reason is that as a country, we spend more than we earn, and then our debt increases. That's a principle that, yes, should make total sense to us on a personal finance level. It's about a budget. In 2024, the U.S. government budget had $6.75 trillion of spending, but only estimated about $4.92 trillion in revenue. That results in a $1.8 trillion deficit for the year of 2024, or in other words, our total national debt increased by about $1.8 trillion. Okay, the next common question that might come up is, where does the U.S. revenue come from? The biggest answer by far is taxes. Individual income taxes, Medicare taxes, and Social Security taxes make up about 80 to 85% of the U.S. government's annual revenue. Corporate income taxes make up about 10%. And then the remaining 5% is comprised of estate taxes, excise taxes, small random things like customs duties and national park fees, and the U.S. government leasing land to cattle farmers out in Montana, like on the show Yellowstone, stuff like that. But basically, the upshot is that the U.S. government gets its revenue from taxes. Okay, now another big question that's floating around here in this conversation that I have not addressed yet, and that question is perhaps multifaceted. You might be asking this question yourself or you've heard others ask it before. And the question is, how is this system even possible? How are we continuing to operate at an annual deficit? Where does the money keep coming from? It's almost like we're snapping our fingers and imagining this money out of thin air. And then ultimately, when will the music stop? Because since there's no real explanation, or at least not an explanation that we've heard before that we understand, and this all seems to be like magical woo-woo money, surely this charade has an expiration date. So to start answering all of those very good questions, we need to talk a little bit about the Federal Reserve and the Treasury and the U.S. debt. The U.S. Treasury is responsible for managing government finances. When the government spends more than it collects in taxes, right, when it operates at that annual deficit that we just talked about, the Treasury will issue bonds, treasury notes, to borrow money to make up for the difference. These bonds are sold to investors, to banks, to foreign governments, and sometimes to the Federal Reserve. The money raised from selling those bonds will fund government programs, will fund infrastructure, will fund defense to make up for the annual deficit. We know this. That's just how it works. Now, I mentioned the Federal Reserve in there, and that's a term or an organization, a part of the government that you've probably heard of before. The Federal Reserve doesn't directly fund the government, but it can buy and sell treasury bonds out in the open market, along with other investors, along with other institutions, as part of the government's overall monetary policy. When the Fed buys treasuries, it injects money into the banking system, which acts to lower interest rates and make borrowing cheaper. When the Federal Reserve sells treasuries, it pulls money out of the overall monetary system, which acts to raise interest rates and tighten financial conditions. We'll get into a little bit of this later, but as Warren Buffett says, interest rates are to the financial system as gravity is to matter. The Fed's actions and the way that it affects interest rates, it touches everything, and it affects everything around us, from mortgage rates to business loans to stock market valuation. So as of this podcast recording in February 2025, the Federal Reserve currently has about $3.6 trillion of treasury debt on its balance sheet. Now, through the act of buying and selling bonds, The Fed sets what's called the short-term or the overnight interest rates, like literally an overnight interest rate. The Fed can be thought of as the government's bank, and the Fed can loan money to all these independent banks all over the country. Like that is how the banking system works. And these loans are made on an overnight basis, and there's an overnight interest rate associated with those loans. And that overnight interest rate influences how expensive it is for the government to borrow or lend money. When rates are low, the Treasury can issue debt more cheaply, keeping interest payments, the government's own interest payments, more manageable. And when interest rates rise, the government's interest costs increase, which can make the national debt more burdensome. Just a really quick aside on exactly how this works. The government has all these outstanding bonds that it's issued over the last year or 2 years or 10 years, or in some cases even 30 years, right? There are 20 and 30-year bonds that exist out there that people would have bought in 2015 and 2010 and 2005 and 2000. And those bonds have a fixed interest rate according to them. Maybe it's a 2% rate, right? Let's say there was a 2% bond issued in 2015 to you listening right now. And 2015, that was 10 years ago, and it was a 10-year bond, and that bond is coming due this year, 2025. And the way it's going to work is this year, the government is going to pay you back the $1,000 that you spent to originally buy that bond in 2025. And so now, in order to pay you that $1,000, the government's already in debt. How's the government going to do that? Well, it has to borrow a new $1,000. And it borrows that new $1,000 by issuing a new bond to some investor who wants to invest in a U.S. Treasury bond. Well, what's the current prevailing interest rate? It's 4 or 4.5%. We think of this, the term that you'll hear is the debt is rolling over. And the old bond, the government was servicing that debt at 2%. Well, now the new bond has to be serviced at 4 or 4.5% based on wherever the overnight rates are on that particular day. Okay, so now what's happened is that the overall U.S. debt payments, the interest payments they make on a daily or annual basis have increased because their old 2% debts essentially got refinanced up to 4.5%. So that is the mechanism by which over time, as you see in the news, that interest rates are rising. Well, the old loans, the old bonds might still have their lower former interest rates, but eventually those bonds are going to have an expiration date, and the money's going to come due, and the government's going to have to refinance to pay those out, and they're going to have to refinance at whatever the rates are at that time. Anyway, that's the mechanism by which, if you did some math in your head, earlier I was talking about how the government's total interest payment this year is going to be just shy of $1 trillion on $36 trillion in debt. And if you do some quick mental math, you'll realize, oh, that's something like a 2.7, 2.8, 2.9% total interest rate. And you might be saying like, wait, I thought the overnight rate right now is like 4 or 4.5%. Well, the reason why is because there's this balance or spectrum of bonds that exist out there, some of which are at 2 or 2.5 or 3%, others which might be at 4 or 5%. And on average, the debt is being paid at 2.8, we'll call it. Anyway, the Fed's job isn't to keep rates low or high. Instead, the Fed has a well-known dual mandate. Their job is to keep unemployment low and also to keep inflation low. In general, low interest rates mean that businesses and the economy can run more smoothly, keeping employment high, but also potentially triggering higher inflation. High interest rates are the opposite. It slows down the economy, potentially hurting employment numbers, but also likely tamping down inflation. One thing the Fed does not care about is the national debt or the national annual interest payment. If the Fed buys large amounts of treasuries, injecting more money into the overall monetary system, it quite literally increases the money supply and contributes to inflation as seen in recent years. And inflation, or in other words, it's more money chasing after fewer goods, it has an interesting effect on the national debt. It should technically make the national debt easier to pay. Just think about your own personal mortgage. Let's say you borrowed $300,000 in 2015 for a mortgage, and your monthly payment was $2,000 a month. Well, is $2,000 a month, right? It's a fixed payment. And now here in 2025, you've received a decade of raises or inflation raises, cost of living raises, since you initially took out that loan. Now your household income is considerably higher than it was 10 years ago. And meanwhile, your mortgage payment is still the same $2,000 a month. Your fixed debt became easier to pay off due to inflation. That monthly debt payment becomes a smaller and smaller fraction of your household income and thus becomes easier to pay off. Some would argue that the national debt has a similar quality about it, and this is part of an economic theory called modern monetary theory, or MMT. MMT is the economic school of thought that says a government that prints its own currency, just like the US does, can never technically run out of money the way a household or a business can. It's not constrained by revenue or taxes the same way that we are constrained by revenue in our own household finances. Instead, modern monetary theory, MMT, argues that the real limit on government spending isn't the size of the national debt, but instead is inflation, right? Inflation is the limit on government spending. So if the government needs to fund something, social programs, infrastructure, wiping out student loans, it can just create the money to do so. No need to find the money through higher taxes or through borrowing. The only catch, of course, to just printing infinite money is that printing too much money can cause inflation, which reduces purchasing power and can kind of spiral an economy out of control. So that's the guardrail in place. According to MMT, taxes and borrowing exist not to fund spending, but instead to manage inflation and redistribute wealth. To me, at least, this is all kind of highfalutin macroeconomic talk. I wouldn't blame you in saying, like, I'm going to have to go back and listen to that blurb a couple times over to fully understand it. But the whole idea, taxes and borrowing money, which, the government does, don't exist to fund spending, but instead only exist to manage inflation, right? We're not worried about spending money. That's what MMT says, because we can always print more money. We're not worried about spending. All we're worried about is having an out of control inflation scenario. And that's why we levy taxes, and that's why we borrow money, or why we have to be careful around those topics, is to not reach an out of control inflation scenario. Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. A few of you occasionally inquire about two different topics that are actually related. The first type of question seeks out details about my professional life and the wealth management firm that I work for here in Rochester, New York. The second type of question involves the best interest, which operates with no advertising, no pushy sales, no paywalls. And the question is, how can the best interest stay afloat? Well, to answer both of those questions, I want to point you to episode 78 of the Best Interest podcast. I intentionally recorded episode 78 to shine light on those topics and inform you how you can actually help the best interest if you're so inclined. So if you've ever been curious about the business of the best interest, please go listen or download episode 78 and let me know what you think. Now, how does this all relate back to the national debt? Well, if MMT is true, or if we are to believe it's true, if we follow those ideas, then the national debt isn't really a problem, at least not in the way that most people think it is. The government issues bonds, takes on debt as a policy choice, not as a necessity. And since the US controls its own currency, since we can print our own money, we can always pay our debts by printing more dollars. The real risk isn't defaulting on our debts then. It's whether all this money creation will overheat the economy and overstimulate inflation to a point when it really gets out of control. But what do the critics say about modern monetary theory? Well, MMT says a government can print as much money as it needs as long as inflation stays in check. Critics argue that's like saying you can eat as much cake as you want as long as you don't get fat. Sure, in theory, there's a limit, but in practice, governments are bad at knowing when to stop. Or in practice, inflation is just too multivariate for a government to easily control. As we saw over recent years here during, the post-COVID era, there's a public fear aspect to inflation that is self-fulfilling. When too many people lose faith and start believing that inflation is out of control, they understandably decide to spend their dollars today rather than wait for inflation to eat away at those dollars' value. And what does the act of spending more dollars today do? Well, think about it. It's too many dollars chasing too few goods. That's the definition of inflation. In other words, the fear of inflation can quite literally cause inflation itself. What a catch-22. Now, MMT claims that the government can control inflation by raising taxes to pull excess money out of the economy. But when was the last time politicians wanted to raise taxes? Critics argue that relying on elected officials to suddenly become disciplined tax-hiking inflation warriors is simply wishful dream thinking. Now, right now, the U.S. borrows money through Treasury bonds. As we know, investors buy them because they trust that the U.S. will repay its debts. But if the government suddenly starts printing money to cover everything, investors might lose faith in the dollar itself. They're going to start demanding a higher interest rate. Or worse, they're going to stop buying the bonds altogether. And that could send borrowing costs soaring through the roof, weakening the economy, again, sending inflation potentially out of control. Anyway, back toward the topic at hand. I do want to revisit one idea that we mentioned a few minutes ago. Now, whether you believe in MMT or not, or whether it's true or not, I do think that you should walk away from this podcast episode thinking to yourself that the US debt is not the same as household debt. And the kind of things that you believe about your own household debt do not necessarily apply to governmental debt. And every time you're at a barbecue where someone is trying to explain how we're $36 trillion in debt, and what would you think if your house was $36 trillion in debt? Or another one of my favorite bits of math is it's understandable. If you take the national debt and you divide it by our population, each citizen here is in $300,000 of debt via the government. Every time you hear something like that, some analogy, some metaphor, some comparison like that, I hope this podcast episode helps you walk away realizing, okay, that sounds a little bit scary, but it's just not true. It's just simply a bad metaphor. Why? Okay, let's discuss why. If you or I rack up too much debt, we eventually have to pay it back, or we go bankrupt. Now, the US government is not the same. As we explained a few minutes ago, it can just keep on rolling over its debt, issuing new bonds to replace the old ones. As long as investors trust the government, and as long as inflation is under control, this cycle can go on indefinitely. In fact, the US has never paid off its debt completely. Even after World War II, when the debt to GDP ratio was well over 100% and we had an annual surplus in our budget, we still didn't use that surplus to pay off our debt. Instead, the US policymakers chose to grow the economy so that the debt became a smaller percentage of the overall pie. Isn't that an interesting fact, right? The US has never paid off its debt. And so again, if we're worried about the current state of the debt, I do get it. I totally understand where that fear comes from. But I think it's worth understanding that at any time in the past 250 years, we could have sat here saying, I don't like the fact that we're in national debt. If this were a household, we wouldn't be in good shape. We have too much debt and we need to pay it off. Well, we've never paid it off, and I think we're doing okay. It's worth keeping that in mind. Now, yes, a household running a deficit month after month is in trouble, but a government running a deficit is not necessarily in the same trouble. Deficits mean that the government is spending more than it collects in taxes. We know this, but that money is still circulating around the economy, often fueling growth. If the spending boosts productivity, if it boosts infrastructure spending or social stability, then it can actually make the economy stronger. I suppose the analogy here would be if a bunch of local families, personal families, were all quote unquote in debt, but they were all using that personal debt to spend money at one another's businesses, the businesses that they owned themselves, well, those businesses would be flourishing. And sooner or later, they could use their business proceeds to pay off their personal debts. That's kind of the same way in which, as long as government spending is stimulating the American economy, all that money is kind of still flowing around the same exact economy. And it's all flowing in a positive direction. Now, it's interesting, though, most of the arguments or points that I'm making today, they all fit under this category of, well, the debt is not necessarily a bad thing. But that does beg a question, at least to me. If it's not a bad thing, then it's a good thing? Well, I'm not sure. Like, genuinely, I don't have a PhD in economics. And when you poll the people who do, you get a wide spectrum of answers. But if we had to make an argument in favor of giant US debt, it would go as follows. First, government debt creates private wealth. For every dollar that the government borrows, someone else holds that debt as an asset. Treasury bonds, as we know, are one of the foundations of the global financial system. Banks, pension funds, insurance companies, individuals all rely on them as a safe, interest-bearing investment. In other words, the government's debt is the private sector's savings. If the US eliminated its debt tomorrow, that would mean wiping out trillions of dollars in assets that people and institutions rely on for financial security, for a foundation, for a safety net. The second reason, deficits fuel economic growth. We just kind of dipped our toe into this. The government spends more than it takes in. Well, that might be good. It means that more money is flowing into the economy, creating jobs, funding infrastructure, supporting innovation. When the private sector slows down, like during a recession, governmental borrowing can step in to keep up demand. Historically, deficit spending has been crucial in times of crisis, like the New Deal during the Great Depression or stimulus packages after 2008 and COVID-19. Without those, we might be looking at a bigger or a more real economic collapse. The third reason is borrowing at near zero cost. So would you in your own life take out a mortgage at 0% interest? Probably. It usually makes a lot of sense to do so. You'd get access to money with no downside. Well, for much of recent history, granted, maybe not today, but much of recent history, the US has borrowed at incredibly low rates. Investors are so eager to hold US debt because it is so secure that they accept returns barely above inflation. If you can borrow money cheaply to invest in things like infrastructure, education, and technology, things that boost long-term societal productivity, I'm not sure that's a problem. It sounds like smart economics instead. The fourth reason, we don't really need to pay it off ever. People act like the US national debt is a credit card bill, but it's not. The US just rolls over the debt indefinitely, as we already explained earlier. As long as the economy grows faster than the debt, which it historically has done, then the burden of that debt shrinks over time. It goes back to our mortgage analogy, right? We took out a mortgage in 2015. It was $2,000 a month. Here in 2025, paying $2,000 a month is much more manageable. That analogy applies to the US national debt. After World War II, we already mentioned debt to GDP was over 100%, but instead of paying off the debt, the economy grew. That's how we used the proceeds. Wages rose, the debt became a smaller burden in the overall pie of governmental spending. Problem solved. And then the last reason, the alternative to having a large national debt might be a worse alternative. What if the government ran a balanced budget every year? It would either have to tax people more, taking more money out of the economy, or cut spending, which hurts growth, hurts education, hurts healthcare, hurts defense. Either way, you get a weaker economy. If people want a strong economy, stable financial markets, continued global leadership, government debt isn't just necessary, it might even be desirable. So while I don't think we've solved national debt through all these ideas today, I think and I hope I've done a good job explaining to you all what's going on and why it's going on and some of the arguments whether it's good or bad. And I hope I've laid to rest the idea that the national debt should be compared to a household debt. If your household could print your own money to pay off your debt, then you can compare it. But since none of us have that printing machine in our basements, the comparison simply does not make sense. So let's transition then to what the national debt means for you, a smart long-term investor who's thinking about your own financial plan. Interest rates, as we talked about before, are the most fundamental force in the economy, kind of like gravity for money, as Warren Buffett would say. Just as gravity pulls objects towards the earth, interest rates pull money toward different uses, shaping everything from personal finance to global markets. When interest rates are low, you can think of money being lighter, right? Less heavy. Borrowing is cheap, businesses expand, home buyers take on bigger mortgages, investors move money into stocks and riskier assets in search of better returns. Economic activity accelerates, just like an object floating in low gravity. But when interest rates rise, money gets heavier. Loans become more expensive. Businesses slow down investment. Home buyers pause. Investors retreat to safer assets like bonds. The economy cools down just as gravity keeps things from drifting endlessly into space. Now, the Federal Reserve acts like the master of gravity, if you will, adjusting rates to keep the economy balanced. If growth is too slow, they lower rates to encourage spending. If inflation runs too hot, they raise rates to slow things down. Interest rates also determine the value of money over time. A dollar today is not the same as a dollar in 10 years. And the rate at which we discount that dollar in 10 years, well, we should probably just use the standard interest rate, the governmental interest rate, to do that discounting. So whether you're borrowing for a home, saving for retirement, watching the stock market, interest rates are the invisible force shaping everything around us. You might not always feel it, but just like gravity, it's always there, pushing, pulling, keeping the economy in motion. Now, interest rates obviously have a major pull on our personal finances. And now the next topic related to the national debt and our personal finances are taxes. Whether you or me or policymakers believe in modern monetary theory or not, I think we all have to admit that we could see a future reality where the public conversation becomes something like, this national debt is simply too crazy and now everyone is going to have to pay more taxes because of it. If that conversation comes to pass, you better believe that life is going to get more expensive. What can we do to protect ourselves from those potential higher taxes? My personal answer, and the answer that I give to my clients, and the answer I'd give to you, involves tax diversification in your long-term investing accounts. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, many of us listening have options on where to save our money. Perhaps it's in a traditional 401k or an IRA, or in the Roth version of those accounts, or in a health savings account, or in a simple taxable brokerage. As we've discussed here on the podcast, on the Best Interest blog at length, these accounts all have different pros and cons and different tax treatments. Some have no future taxes. Some are taxed as ordinary income. Some get taxed minimally if your overall income is low, but then get taxed more if your overall income becomes high. The summary, though, is that the money that you have in these different tax buckets gives you an option for how you want to withdraw that money in the future, in your retirement, when we don't know what the taxes will be like. But we're talking about this idea right now that maybe the taxes will be much higher. It's nice in that situation if you have some dials to turn, depending on what the national and state tax policy looks like. I mean, the analogy I always give is if we look at the current political climate, in general, right-wing conservative Republicans generally want to lower taxes. Left-wing liberal Democrats generally want to raise taxes. So let's just take that as a rule of thumb. Not that it's always the case, but let's just take it as a rule of thumb. And let's imagine for the rest of our lives, every 4 years, the political parties flip-flop. Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican. And as they flip-flop, it's taxes go up, taxes go down, taxes go up, taxes go down. Well, if you have a portfolio put together involving some of these different accounts that I just talked about, when taxes go up, I'm going to pull money more out of my Roth account because there's no taxes due. And I'm probably going to pull money out of my taxable account, at least some of money out of my taxable account, because as long as I keep my overall income low, I'm going to pay 0% capital gains taxes there. But then during the Republican years, when they come in and they want to lower taxes, well, at lower tax rates, I can stomach the idea of paying income taxes. So those might be the years when I pull money out of my traditional investment accounts. You know what? I'd rather pay income taxes during those years. I'm going to have to pay the taxes eventually anyway. So that's the idea behind that tax diversification.
Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. Every week, I send a quick free email to thousands of readers that shares 3 simple things. 1, my new articles and podcasts. 2, the best financial content of the week from all over the internet. And 3, a financial chart that explains some important concept in the news that week. It's a great primer to boost your financial know-how.
But Jesse, I don't want another email.
Well, this might not be for you, but I do hear you, which is why I make it very short, sweet, and full of only the essentials. A whopping 66% of subscribers read my email at least once a month. They're enjoying it, and maybe you will too. You can subscribe for free on the homepage at bestinterest.blog. Again, that's a free, no-strings-attached subscription at bestinterest.blog.
Now, another big topic that affects us all and has to do with the national debt is inflation. Perhaps we're already living through a period where major decisions at the federal level surrounding debt and printing money have affected inflation. We've all been to the grocery store. We all know how our eggs and blueberries have gone up in price. And ideally, if we want to insulate ourselves from national debt problems, part of the solution is shielding yourself from inflation as best you can. To me, the tool I want to wield here is my investment portfolio. I'm going to link an article in the show notes about what kind of investments, at least historically, have fared well against inflation. Granted, it was to answer a specific question about the post-COVID era, so we only looked at data from like 2020 to 2022. But long story short, if we're talking about how to position our portfolio to combat inflation, the answer is definitely not bonds and cash, even high-yield cash accounts. Right? If the value of a dollar is decreasing around us, which is what inflation does, then the last thing we want is an investment instrument that is paying us a fixed income of dollars. And there's a reason why, even though you can get a 4% from a high yield savings account right now in early 2025, it is genuinely a bad idea to keep too much of your money in cash. It pains me every time someone says, yeah, I know there's inflation and sometimes stocks do well, but I've got half my money earning 4% in a money market right now. That's pretty darn good. Yeah, I mean, 4% is better than 1%. I agree with you there, but it's also not going to stay at 4% forever. It's definitely going to lose ground to inflation over the long run. And meanwhile, the probabilities are that a diversified stock allocation is going to crush whatever returns you're getting there. So again, to summarize that, cash and bonds are not a good investment to combat inflation. There are other reasons to hold cash and bonds, right? We talk about this all the time, and I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but the reason to have cash and bonds is because they're stable for money that you know you're going to need in the short run. And essentially, the logic there is we say, yeah, I know over the next couple of years, I understand that my bond allocation is probably going to lose some ground to inflation. I'm willing to stomach that cost because the benefit I get is the stability from the cash or the bonds to spend on these things that I know I'm going to spend in the next couple of years. I'm willing to trade that stability against the cost of losing a little bit of ground to inflation. But over 5 or 10 or 20 years, personally at least, that is not a trade I'm willing to make. Okay, so what is a trade I'm willing to make, or what is an investment that I want to pursue to combat inflation? Well, some people would say that the anti-inflation investment is real estate. Maybe. I will say, though, in our recent bout of inflation, real estate ended up being a terrible hedge. The reason there likely has much more to do with COVID, which crushed the commercial real estate market, than it has to do with inflation. On the surface, at least, I can definitely buy the argument that over time, real estate prices will rise with overall inflation, making real estate a decent hedge against inflation. But really, at the end of the day, I look at stocks, another good idea, because as businesses, and again, stocks are nothing more than businesses, as businesses face rising costs, as their costs increase due to inflation, they can pass those costs on to their customers in the form of rising prices. Their earnings will increase, their margins stay stable, and in a nutshell, you get rising stock prices to coincide with increasing inflation. If inflation chomps away at us, it's also likely going to negatively affect Social Security. And yes, there are COLA, cost of living increases to Social Security, and they are there to help keep up with inflation, and they typically do a decent job at that. But one thing I suspect we'll never see is a COLA increase that outpaces inflation. So again, if we want to position our stock portfolio to combat the potential inflation that's going to be a ramification of this national debt, essentially, I go back to just goals-based investing, and I say, over the short run, I want to hold bonds and cash. I know it'll lose ground to inflation, but at least it's going to be there stable for me for my short-term spending needs. And then over the long run, over these long periods of time where, I'm really worried about how inflation might eat away at my portfolio over 10 or 20 or 30 years, well, that's where a stock allocation, again, historically, we can look at the historical data and we can see that stocks have provided a real inflation-adjusted positive return over long timelines like that. They outpace inflation, but then even if we take a step back and just look at it theoretically and say, well, why do we expect that to be the case in the future? How do stocks outperform inflation? Why might that continue again in subsequent years? The answer is because the businesses that underlie stocks have ways of passing inflation costs onto the consumer, keeping their margins and their earnings positive. And that ultimately is what provides us with our positive stock return. Now, something that we can do in our personal finances that uses debt to our advantage is that we can potentially lock in debt inside our lives when rates are low. It's much easier said than done, and some of it just has to do with the timing of our own lives. I know that taking on debt can be a sharp double-edged sword against us. But when I work with someone who has their forever home locked in at a 2.5% mortgage that they got in 2018, wow, that's pretty awesome. Now, other than the incredibly low rate, the key here, again, is that the rate is fixed. It's the same principle as to why we don't want to invest in bonds over long periods of inflation. We don't want to buy someone else's debt. The same principle is why we don't mind taking on debt during those periods. We already covered that idea today, right? Your fixed monthly or yearly debt payment becomes easier and easier to pay over time. Now, lastly, but certainly importantly, we need to think about our own household income, our careers, and our earnings potentials, and how they are kind of related to this what if the national debt affects us personally conversation. So much of what we're talking about here today is simply out of our control. But perhaps the financial dial that we have the most control over is our own earnings potential. Now, that dial is definitely challenging to turn in the short run. It's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine when I'll see someone in the financial content creation space, especially, this is like an Instagram or a TikTok or like a Twitter thing that I'll see. And someone will just say, it's easy, just to increase your income. Well, okay, that's a really hard dial to turn over the short run. Obviously, if it was easy to go out and double your income tomorrow, why wouldn't you be doing it, right? That enough is proof to say that it's not easy to do, but it is within our locus of control. And whether that means having some hard conversations with your boss, going out and pursuing a degree or a certification, starting a little side hobby and seeing where it goes. Now, none of these paths are necessarily easy. They can't necessarily be done overnight, but they are worth exploring. Again, you're not going to be able to dictate federal tax policy or the prices at the grocery store or the returns from your stock portfolio. You're just going to have to deal with the cards that you're dealt there. But you can have a more direct control over your long-term earnings. More money, more income doesn't necessarily lead to more happiness, but it certainly buys you flexibility in this world, and that's worth pursuing. At the end of the day, the U.S. national debt is complex, but it's not the same as household debt. The government is not a family sitting around the kitchen table balancing a checkbook. It operates under entirely different rules. Some experts argue that the debt actually fuels growth. Others warn of future consequences, and most recognize that it's not as simple as good or bad to have national debt or to be operating at an annual deficit. Now, what does it all mean for you in your personal lives? Well, we should keep an eye on interest rates as they impact everything around us from mortgage payments to stock valuations. We should understand that the government debt and economic growth are deeply connected, meaning policy decisions can affect your investments in your financial future. But in my opinion, we shouldn't get caught up in fear-driven headlines or kind of these overblown political arguments that go on. At the end of the day, we should control what we can control, and a well-diversified long-term investment plan remains, in my opinion, the best way to navigate economic uncertainty, along with our own ability to control our earnings and build our own careers as best we can. The U.S., our government, we have carried debt since our inception. It's part of our DNA. And unless something drastic changes, it will continue to be that way. So the real question is not, will we pay off our debt, but rather, how will we manage it? And more importantly, for you listening, how can you position yourself to thrive no matter what?
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. If you have a question for Jesse to answer on a future episode, send him an email over at his blog, The Best Interest. His email address is jesse@bestinterest.blog. Again, that's jesse@bestinterest.blog. Did you enjoy the show? Subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen. This helps others find the show and invest in knowledge themselves. And we really appreciate it. We'll catch you on the next episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors is a personal podcast meant for education and entertainment. It should not be taken as financial advice, and it's not prescriptive of your financial situation.